Okay, hello chess players. Recently I played a game online. I had the black pieces, and I thought the endgame that we got into in this particular game was pretty instructive, so I just felt like I should go over that game today, and more specifically just go over this endgame. So the game started out as a Sicilian defense. We have an e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c d4, knight d4. We had a Sicilian dragon, and you can see that white takes the Yugoslav setup, but then he goes ahead and he castles kingside. This allows the move queen b6. So Queen b6 is an idea that's pretty common within these setups. Whenever you have the bishop kind of floating here on e3, a lot of times queen b6 is possible because it hits both here and it hits here. And it sets up either a shot with knight takes e4 or knight to g4, depending on where the white king is located. So this is a pretty common tactical trick. Basically, the idea is that something like knight f5 isn't going to work here because I have queen captures b2. You can't get away with this if the bishop is on b3, and of course this doesn't work like if the bishop on e3 is already held, for example, if the queen is already on d2. And in a lot of cases, it also depends on where the king is located, whether it's located on e1 or g1, for your follow-up. So my opponent plays bishop b3, which is of course correct. This allows the follow-up with knight to g4, which should be slight edge black. Now, when deciding whether you should play knight to g4 or knight takes e4, because the other possibility is, of course, knight takes e4, you have to kind of take a look and see where the white king is at. In this case, knight takes e4 would lose immediately to knight d5, because, of course, you don't have this move queen a5 check, because there's no king on the e1 square to check. So you don't have knight takes e4, knight takes d5 just wins a piece. Queen a5, f takes e4, you just lose that knight. So you have to play knight to g4, which does work. And then after f takes g4, we have bishop d4, queen d4, queen d4, knight d4. And this position should be slight edge black. But this is where the endgame sort of starts. The position is slight edge black, but it's really nothing more than that. Realistically, black shouldn't have enough to win. White continued by defending his pawn. He played h3, and now we have this situation where we have an endgame where black has a very, very slight edge because he has better central pawns, and of course white has this weakness on the e4 square. But realistically, white really only has the one weakness, and one weakness just is not enough to lose a game of chess. So you kind of have to try to engineer some other advantages or some other weaknesses. So that's sort of the reason for my next move. I play bishop e6. I'm trying to get him to capture on e6, which he obliges. He plays bishop takes e6. I play f takes e6. And now I have a little bit more to work with. I have an open f file, and I have this immediate pressure on the c2 square that he has to defend. So maybe I can kind of turn this into two weaknesses, like the c2 square and the e4 square. But it's still unclear that black has enough to win. So my opponent plays rook ac1, and then I make a mistake. I actually play rook ac8, which is a very natural move, just putting my rook on the open c-file, putting some pressure on the c-file, just trying to slowly improve my position. Apparently the correct move was to exchange, like rook takes f1, king takes f1, and then to play this rook to the f-file, and then just target these two weaknesses directly. After the king moves, I would have rook to f4, and now I'm putting pressure on e4 and c2. So the computer liked this the best to try to press for a win. One of the things that you have to understand with positions like this, starting with rook ac1, is these are maybe, I think, some of the most important positions to study and some of the most important positions to analyze, because the positions do not have a definite result. You know, it's very, very slight edge black, but one side is clearly going to be pressing, black is going to be pressing, but it's not so clear that black ever should have enough to win in this position. Maybe the objective result is a draw. And I think these positions are very instructive to learn how to defend from the white side, so that you can always get these draws if you know what you're doing. And I also think it's very instructive to learn these positions from the black side so that we learn how to press in these positions and we learn how to make the most out of what we've got. How do we press our position? How do we make more happen in this position? And generally speaking, the person that wins these positions is the person that plays the positions with the fewest number of errors and the person that just plays these positions a little bit more accurately. So, anyways, I play rook ac8. My opponent plays rook takes f1, which is rook takes f8, which is actually very good. King takes f8. We have king f2, and then we have b5, threatening b4, which would go after the c2 pawn. But unfortunately for me, white is in time to save it. He plays king e3. This gains a tempo against the knight. And then after e5, he plays king d3, which defends the c2 square. So now I have to make a pretty big decision about what to do moving forward. And apparently I made kind of the wrong decision. I played the move e6, just trying to maintain my position and trying to build up to do more things later. Now, it's not that I didn't understand that it would be nice to keep the square open for the knight. I totally understood that. Like, maybe I could even just play knight e6 right here, try to remaneuver the knight with knight c5 or knight to f4. But I have some other liabilities within the position. Of course, the b5 square is hanging. Should I try to defend that square with a6 first, etc.? It was a little unclear. But as it turns out, maybe even just knight e6 right away was better than pawn to e6. Leaving that e6 square open for the knight was better. So I should have left that square open, but I was just a little unsure about potentially sacrificing this pawn on b5, even though I do have a lot of resources if he takes the pawn on b5. I have knight c5, knight f4, and of course rook b8 are all possible moves if he plays knight takes b5. But instead, I just decided to shore up everything, e6, and this makes the position very, very close to equal, according to the engine. But it does make black's position completely safe. There's not going to be any infiltration with knight to d5, and black is going to be able to batten up the hatches a little further in a move. After a3, I play a6, which means that now my knight is free to maneuver without risk of dropping any material. But I have fewer squares to now maneuver my knight to. I don't have the e6 square available to me, so there's not going to be any knight e6 to c5 or knight e6 to f4. So any type of maneuver with the knight is going to be pretty long-winded. It's going to be something like knight c6, d8, b7 to c5. And then, of course, if I do go on that long trip, he could just play b4 at some point, and then I have to remaneuver again and get my knight to the c4 square. And it's not so simple to get it there in a reasonable amount of time. By the time I get it there, he'll probably have a knight ready to exchange for it, and I'm just not going to get anything out of it. So maneuvering at this point to get some sort of advantage is going to be pretty long-winded. But my opponent kind of did me a favor here. Instead of keeping everything on the board and making me try to figure out how to maneuver my knight and maneuver my rook to take advantage of the very slight two weaknesses that I have in the position, mainly the e4 pawn and the c2 pawn, trying to put pressure on both of these with some very long-winded knight and rook maneuvers, he makes my job a little bit easier by playing knight e2 and simply offering the exchange of knights. This means that I can turn this position into a rook and pawn endgame, which again should be slight edge black, where black has the possibility of pressing. So after knight e2 I exchange, and then I play rook to c4, hitting that weakness, and then after king to d3, I could either play d5 right away or play the way I played it, which was rook d4 check first. And then the point is that after d5 he has no choice but to exchange, and this leaves black with a central passed pawn, versus this queenside majority, where I'm going to be able to get in some sort of minority attack beginning with a5 and b4, and I'm going to be able to sort of liquidate this queenside and simplify these pawns, which means that the final version of this rook and pawn endgame should just be a central passed rook pawn that's already advanced versus white essentially just trying to hold. Now, in white's defense, white has good chances to hold. His king is already sitting directly in front of my passed pawn. That is the best location for the king in terms of where you need it to defend. And if he gets some rook activity and he's able to utilize his activity in the right way, he should be able to hold this position. But holding it is actually very complicated. It's much easier to press from here with the black pieces than it is to hold this position with white. So my opponent plays c3, which isn't bad. Rook to c4, rook f1 check, king e7, and then g5, trying to get his rook active by bringing it to the f6 square, which, all being completely fair, is not a terrible strategy. You really do want to go active in these rook and pawn endgames, so this is not a bad way to go. So I play a5, conducting my minority attack. We're trying to liquidate this 3-on-2. We don't want white to be able to turn this into a passed pawn. We would rather liquidate all of these pawns and just turn this into an isolated pawn, or even potentially just win these pawns on the queen side. This is a good way for black to improve without risking anything in his position. So then rook f6 got played. I start liquidating. I play b4. We have ab, ab, and then king to d3. We have bc, bc. Okay, now here I actually made a mistake. It's probably a very winnable position for black if black just proceeds with the move rook to a4 with the threat of rook to a2. And of course I did see this idea, which is evidenced by my next move, but I missed that after my next move, white has a very curious looking equalizing idea. I actually thought my move, which was to gain space with my passed pawn, was a more nuanced way of playing rook a4, because after e4 check, he has to bring the king back to the second rank, and then after rook a2, I'm threatening rook a2. After rook a4, I'm threatening rook a2 with check, which seems like a much stronger version. What I missed was after king e3, rook a2, which is what got played, my opponent has this interesting option that I completely overlooked, and it was caught by the engine, but it apparently equalizes. Apparently, white can liquidate everything with c4. Now, during the game, it's not that I didn't see this idea, it's that I didn't see this idea as being dangerous, because it looked like everything liquidated and black was going to end up at least up a pawn, possibly 2 pawns. So, for example, I could play takes, rook over, takes, 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 and I thought, well, I'm up quite a bit of material here. But what I missed was he can go after the h-pawn, and then after he goes after the h-pawn, even if I defend my e-pawn, I can't make any progress. He can just attack my pawn, defend his h-pawn, and I have actually no way of advancing my position with his king sitting directly in front of my passed pawn. I can't defend it and move my rook out of the way and get check all in one move. So this would very easily be a draw. The computer gave this as complete equality. And that was white's last chance to completely equalize. I got pretty lucky. After here, I played rook a2. My opponent decided to defend his pawns. He played rook f2. I exchanged, and then this is a completely winning king and pawn endgame. After king to c5, we have g4, we have king c4, and then just simply zoning this king out of the pawn. And of course, this was the other reason that this e4 pawn check was very appealing to me. I knew that any scenario where I enter a king and pawn endgame is going to be completely winning. Now, that being said, the same would have been true if I just kept the pawn duo exactly how it was, and it would have prevented the idea of c4. But again, to be totally fair in defense of me and in defense of my opponent, it's not clear that rook a4 led to a win. It's quite possible that even after rook a4, white could still fight to hold. A lot of the same dynamics are in play. It's difficult for black to advance without allowing counterplay or liquidation, and of course, it's difficult for black to make progress even in scenarios where he's up an entire pawn when the king is planted firmly in front of that passed pawn. But the end result, of course, was a happy result for me. I ended up winning the game. Black was always just a little bit better in the endgame and was always able to find ways to press, and I just needed a few mistakes from my opponent in order to convert that into a win. As far as my opponent goes, my opponent played extremely well trying to hold this position and was just inches away from holding the position. He just needed to play this pawn to c4 and liquidate at the right moment. And if he'd liquidated at the right moment, it would have been sort of impossible for black to make progress and impossible to win. So you need to understand how to press these positions and play for a win. And you also need to understand how to try to defend these positions and try to hold that draw if you find yourself sort of on the back foot and in these situations. How do you liquidate these pawns? How do you position your king? How do you play for activity? How do you keep your opponent from making progress? These are all very important ideas in endgames like this. So anyways, I hope you found this practical rook and pawn endgame pretty instructive. Again, it came from one of my own games, and I just thought it was really interesting. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much.